very glad to see that a meeting concerning terrorism, counter-terrorism, is taking place almost 10 years exactly after the first one we had in Goa in 2004. And therefore, I would personally like to welcome our friends from the United States and the community here to this meeting. At this session, we have a very remarkable person to speak to us about systems approaches to countering terrorism. Dr. Augustine is a Princeton graduate and well known as the chairman and CEO of Lockheed Martin. But that's only one part of his professional life. He's a real engineer citizen. He has worked for his country on a variety of projects and done extremely well, has been widely honored by the United States government. He's really an engineer citizen because he takes a great deal of interest in many public affairs. But what's somewhat unusual for engineers, he's also a very articulate man. Right from Augustine's laws to reports like the Gathering Storm, he has had a profound influence on the way that engineers look on their own profession. So, Dr. Augustine, pleasure that you're here.
Well, thank you very much. And as I said before, I consider it a particularly great honor to be able to participate in this session with a group of experts from both India and the United States. We're certainly addressing an issue that's of the utmost importance to both of our countries. I might just say in addition that I've had the privilege of traveling in India really throughout most of your country, or much of your country, over the years, and it's one of my favorite places to visit with all the color and dynamism and activity, so I'm personally very happy to be back. Unfortunately, the subject that brings us together today is not as pleasant, terrorism. And it's clear from my most recent trip to India when we met with the planning committees to prepare for this gathering that our two countries have a large number of common interests when it comes to countering terrorism, not to mention, as I said before, both having suffered greatly at the hands of terrorists. America has a great deal to learn from India's experience, and I hope that America's experience might prove of value to our colleagues from India. In the years just prior to the tragedy that now is referred to around the world simply as 9/11, I had the occasion to serve on a commission that was established by the U.S. Congress. The purpose was to investigate U.S. national security in the decades ahead. And arguably the most significant sentence in our paragraph in our final report read as follows. I should mention to you that this was a report issued before 9/11, about a little less than a year before 9/11. This paragraph went, states, terrorists, and other disaffected groups will acquire weapons of mass destruction and mass disruption, and some will use them. Americans will likely die on American soil, possibly in very large numbers. Our report was named after its two co-chairs, Senator Gary Hart and Senator Warren Rudman, one a Democrat, the other a Republican. And the report proved, unfortunately, only too prescient when the events of 9/11 occurred shortly after the report was issued. One of the major recommendations of the report, which became known as the Hart-Rudman report, was to bring together the 22 different elements of our federal government that had significant responsibilities for counterterrorism. And as you're very well aware, when dealing with systems problems such as terrorism, fragmentation of effort is one of the greatest barriers to successfully carrying out the counterterrorism mission. And indeed, as we belatedly learned following the events of 9/11, there had been warnings that had we been able to fit together the pieces of the puzzle, we might have been able to avoid that tragedy. As you know, a Department of Homeland Security was created as we had recommended, but only after 9/11. The scales of terrorism seem to be tipped very much in the favor of terrorists. Terrorists can decide where they wish to act, when they wish to act, and how they wish to act. And this places the counter-terrorist forces in the untenable position of having to be prepared for everything, everywhere, all the time, something that's an obvious impossibility. The terrorist ranges of choices go all the way from biological attacks to physical attacks, from attacks on the economy to attacks on the food supply, and far more. The implication of all this seems to me to be that the defense has to be prepared to take an offensive role as well as a defensive role, something that could be very controversial. But this, along with other possible acts, requires balancing risks and intelligently allocating resources. And that, of course, is what we mean by systems thinking. And I would like to make a few introductory remarks as I've been asked about systems thinking and as it relates to the counterterrorism mission, and to sort of set the stage for some other more specific examples in the case studies that will follow. Going back to the years of the Cold War, both sides, you'll recall, adopted what seemed to be a very irrational strategy of mutual assured destruction, or MAD as it was sometimes called. And remarkably, the Cold War did end without a shot being fired between the two major blocs. But unfortunately, that strategy is rather bankrupt when one deals with terrorists, in that it assumes a rational enemy, and in particular an enemy that does not wish to die in carrying out its aims, whereas in contrast, another of the advantages that are possessed by many terrorists is a willingness or even a desire to die in carrying out their activities on behalf of their cause. And we've seen this both in Mumbai and on 9/11. I would assert that in the intervening years since the Cold War ended, there have been two major changes, both brought about by technology, that have profoundly affected the role and consequences of terrorism. And the first of those changes was what we've come to call globalization. And the second is the amplification of destructive power available to individuals. And with respect to the former, modern jet aircraft have made it possible to move things, including people, around the world at very nearly the speed of sound. And modern information systems have made it possible to move ideas, knowledge, data around the world literally at the speed of light. Francis Cairncross, writing in The Economist, referred to this phenomenon as the death of distance, and indeed, distance has died. What happens in Bangalore now matters in Boston, and what happens in New Delhi matters in New York. Then turning to the magnified power of the individual, for the first time in the history of the world, individuals or very small groups acting alone can profoundly impact the lives of very large groups of people. That is a big change. And this, of course, has been the consequence of nuclear weapons, biological weapons, to a lesser degree, radiological and chemical weapons, and other kinds of attacks. These developments have been exacerbated by the growing interconnectivity and interdependence across nations and within nations of supporting assets, as well as concentrations of people in small physical areas. Terrorists that seek to exert the use of some weapons cannot maintain control over the people that they attack, but they can fairly well deny effective control of regular governments over their population. Certainly it makes no sense for terrorists to engage in conventional warfare against powerful nations like India or the United States. That's why, of course, they become terrorists. And the impact of such individuals and groups can often produce a psychologically disproportionate effect on the populace. There's this amplification factor that takes place. An example with which I'm intimately familiar concerned two young men, not very bright young men, who had one weapon, namely a rifle, and a few years ago terrorized Washington, D.C. for over a week. They created traffic congestions throughout the metropolitan area. They succeeded in killing 10 people, innocent people. But that was during a time period that 10 people died in our same area due to automobile accidents that went largely unnoticed by the population as a whole, other than by their families and their friends. So there is this amplification factor that makes smaller acts have powerful impacts. So what's to be done? And I would assert that to begin with, terrorism does have to be viewed as a systems problem. And by that I mean that the challenge of terrorism has to be addressed by the whole, not individually by parts of the problem. This permits one to optimize the use of one's resources and to look for weak links in chains that often can reveal very highly leveraged actions that the counter-terrorist forces could take. Consider the possibility of using commercial aircraft as a weapon, as happened on 9/11. That was something that had certainly been addressed well before 9/11 by security organizations, as well, unfortunately, as by terrorists. In an examination as a systems problem of all the elements involved, one might have concluded that the best thing that one could do would be to reinforce the cockpit doors on commercial aircraft. Not a high-tech solution, not a very expensive solution, but had we done that relatively simple act, we probably could have prevented 9/11 from occurring, at least as it happened. The challenge, of course, is that systems problems tend to be exceedingly complex, terrorism being one of the ultimate examples. Consider, for example, the simplest of all possible systems, a system that has two elements that can impact each other in a digital fashion, the simplest of all fashions. In other words, either on or off. Well, if you have two elements, obviously there are four possible states for that system. You can have each element impacting the other, neither impacting the other, the first impacting the second, or the second impacting the first. So there are four possible states with a system with just two elements. But if you go to a system with three elements, one discovers that there are suddenly 64 possible states. Professor Friedrich Weichhurst of the Max Planck Institute derived the equation that describes the number of possible states for a complex system. And he appropriately termed his equation, he called it the monster. And indeed, it is a monster. If you have just 7 elements in a system of the type I described, the number of possible states exceeds the number of stars in our galaxy. The conclusion, I think, is evident, and that is that one can't plan for or even consider every possible situation in a complex system. That brings us to the importance in systems thinking, of systems engineering, of risk management, of trade-offs, because you can't do everything. It can help reveal how best to allocate limited resources. To answer questions like these, one first must learn to think like a terrorist, something not easily done. And secondly, one has to understand one's own value system and what the terrorist view of your value system might be. When dealing with threats that are both likely and highly consequential, then one is generally best served by a defense in depth, because no single layer of defense is likely to provide a high enough degree of protection. And fortunately, the challenge of complex system, though, applies to the attacker or the terrorist as well, which is why it's helpful to continue to change the defense as part of a system. A simple example would be at the airport, to have in one area a magnetometer, and another area a chemical sniffer. Another would be to have dogs in the area, and to change these from time to time so that an attacker couldn't be aware in advance of what sort of sensing would be in use. Furthermore, a strategy of this type makes the attacker's job require better coordination. And even if the individual elements aren't terribly effective, they may force the attacker into a situation where they are vulnerable to other means of detection because the need for more coordination, the need for more communication. I would cite an example of a not high-tech case that occurred during the Vietnam War, when a friend of mine was commanding a U.S. artillery base that was continually being attacked in the middle of the night by Viet Cong. My friend did a systems analysis of the attacks, and it occurred to him and to his colleagues that the enemy had very poor tactical communications. They had to plan the attacks in advance, rehearse them, and have them very coordinated. And it occurred to him if he could get inside of their communications cycle, he could change the entire situation. So what they did was every evening just before dusk, well, first they put all the guard towers and the defensive positions on skids. And every evening just before dark, they would take bulldozers out, move them all around, and change the puzzle. They were never attacked again at that particular base. A very non-high-tech example, but a very effective one coming out of systems thinking. Let me return to the subject of defensive depth and of not being confined to a purely defensive posture. It's important to understand that the enemy's motives, as well as their limitations, that they too must be understood. And the latter, as we heard earlier, is a very great challenge in democracies, in free societies. And it's very likely that this will become a greater and greater issue as technology advances further. The question, how does government protect its citizenry against terrorist attacks and at the same time not invade the privacy that those citizens expect living in a democracy? Given an understanding of the values that one assigns to one's own assets, both physical and societal, and an understanding of the enemy and the enemy's modus operandi, a systems approach would call for disrupting a potential attacker's plans through both active and passive means before they could take any action, as well as taking actions to minimize the impact of an attack should it occur. So having done that in this defensive depth, what remains is to enhance the defenses of important targets, to counter whatever attack actually occurs, and finally to recover from the attack. And something that isn't often talked about but is very important, and that is to be able to provide forensics regarding the origin of the attack. It's noteworthy that an informed citizenry can do a great deal to help protect itself. However, my own surveys in the United States, admittedly highly non-scientific surveys, reveal that most citizens, even generally well-informed citizens, are not aware of what they can do in this regard of helping protect themselves. For example, in a chemical attack, if you go out on the street and ask people if there's a chemical attack, should you go to your attic or to your basement? Or you ask in the case of a nuclear attack, should you go to the basement or to the attic? Or in the case of a radiological attack in a particular area, should you try to get to the north, to the east, the south, or the west, depending on what the prevailing winds are at a given locale? Or in the case of a biological attack, should one go to the hospital to get a vaccination, get vaccine, or should one stay in your house? And if you stay in your house and seal the doors and windows up, how long can you live before you become asphyxiated? Well, my surveys show that very few people know the answer to any of those questions. And yet, were they to know, they would be able to greatly reduce the casualties in major attacks. Finally, I would note that first and foremost in dealing with both terrorism and counterterrorism, one is dealing with people. And people can intentionally as well as unintentionally fail to carry out their responsibilities. I refer, of course, to the matter of insider threats. This could be forestalled to some degree through thorough personnel assessments, through random task assignments of personnel, and again, defense in depth, including the use of so-called two-key control systems. But understandably, human behavior does play an important role in both the success of terrorists and the success of those seeking to counter terrorism. I recently had the occasion to investigate on behalf of our government an incident that you may have read about where an 82-year-old nun and two 60-year-old drifters cut through 4 secure fences, went through 3 secure zones in the middle of the night at one of our most highly defended facilities without being detected, got to the outside of the building that was being protected. Presumably they were not terrorists, they were protesters. They got to the outside of the building, nobody showed up to arrest them. This is all recorded on night vision television. They took a hammer out of their backpack and proceeded to pound on the walls, hoping to bring a guard to arrest them. The guards heard the pounding and thought, oh, the carpenters are working late tonight. Ultimately, they were arrested, but one asked, how could this possibly happen? And that was the question that 3 of us were asked who were assigned to investigate the incident and say, how did it happen? How could it happen? And could it happen anywhere else? And there are, of course, many factors that contributed to this incident. However, most could be summarized in one word, and that would be culture. First of all, the guards, as is the case in many, many cases, went to work every day knowing that it was highly unlikely that in their entire lifetime they would ever face a real threat. Furthermore, in this case, the electronic warning devices had so many false alarms that the guards generally didn't pay much attention to them. Thirdly, realistic training exercises weren't possible because if you made them sufficiently realistic, people would be killed. And you add to this fact that the guards' responsibilities at such facilities are immense. In other words, they require intelligent people. But there's nothing more boring than standing in a dark hallway holding an M16 for 10 hours a day. And so you have very bright people in a very boring job. And that's a hypergolic combination, to borrow a phrase from aerospace. Based on this incident, it was concluded that one has to rotate work assignments, work shorter shifts, certainly demand higher levels of discipline, and do every form of training you possibly can that remains safe. But once again, one cannot reduce risk to 0. So by examining terrorism as a system problem, it would appear that by prioritizing vulnerabilities, by prioritizing the value of assets, prioritizing the choices one has, that the impact of terrorists could be substantially reduced. And I suspect that's been one of the contributors to the reduction in terrorism in both of our countries in recent years, or successful terrorism, I should say. That's something I would never have predicted on 9/12. Well, I hope you will find these introductory remarks that I've shared as useful. I certainly expect to learn a great deal from our Indian colleagues while we're here, and along with my American colleagues to contribute where I can. This is a gathering that could make a great difference, and I certainly hope that will be the case. Thank you very much.